Okay, so this is going to be a longer video because my camera is fully charged, so I'm not having to use my phone anymore. Okay, so once you get into chapter 1, we find out that basically our narrator, Nick Carraway, believes that he's different than everyone else. So he views himself as being someone who is able to read people pretty well, and because he reads people pretty well, he often finds that he doesn't like people. So for him, it's a matter of he wants to be around people, but he also kind of feels isolated from them. We also find out a little bit about Nick's family. So for me, it's page 3. He talks about where his family is from. And he says, my family have been prominent, well-to-do people in the Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we are descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on to this day. So a couple of things. One, the Dukes of Buccleuch, that's actually an allusion. Remember, we've talked about the idea of allusion. So a reference to a famous person, place, or thing that has a deeper meaning in regards to the narrative. So in this instance, you need to take note that the term Duke is actually a royalty term. It would be something that you would see in a monarchy, which is important if we're talking about this being an American novel, because throughout this novel, we see these references to the idea of like Great Britain having this monarchy, and like, aren't we glad that we Americans don't have a monarchy anymore, and like we have a democracy. But one of the questions that Fitzgerald raises is, if you have people with all of this money and they have access to all of these things, while all of the peasantry or the serfdom doesn't have access to these things, which we'll see in the Valley of the Ashes later on in the novel, then are we that different from a monarchy? Like, did we get away from that much? If they have that much power and that much influence, like, how different are we? And again, if you're having that rebellious, like, wait, Kohanam, I disagree, good. You should disagree. You should have those concepts going through your head as we're going through. And it's also important that you notice that they've created this narrative that they are from royalty, even though they aren't, right? He says it's a false notion, right? He says that we have this story that we tell that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but we're not really, right? In fact, my grandfather's brother who came here in 51 sent a substitute to Civil War. So not only did they not descend from royalty, they're kind of not good people, morally speaking, because he didn't fight in the Civil War to establish this country. He sent someone in his stead. He sent someone else to die for him in the Civil War, which is kind of, awful. Not die, but like to fight for him, right? So that says like, maybe not that great. And then Buccleuch is the allusion. So that, remember we talked about the idea of a famous person, place, or thing. That actually was a Scottish dukedom of the 17th century. That was an actual like royal clan of the 17th century. So it is an allusion to something famous. The next paragraph that you see there, he's beginning to talk about the idea of World War I and like what he's doing monetarily. And we see the first reference to the idea of the egg. So if you look at the first sentence of that paragraph on page 3, the second paragraph, it says, I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in my father's office. So again, we talked about the idea of the outside of the egg being white. So it looks pure, but on the inside, it's yellow. It's tainted purity. So moving on to the next few pages, when he's talking about the idea of the eggs, it's just him sort of talking about the construct of like what this kind of looks like, because we're supposed to see that these two aspects of these villages are supposed to be egg-shaped, and that's just symbolic, right? So the outside of them looks pretty, right? So if you've ever seen the movie The Truman Show, where everything looks beautiful and perfect and pristine, but on the inside it's kind of fake and crumbling and falling apart. So you might relate this to the idea of someone who is just like Instagram, right? They have the Instagram filter on everything. So everything looks amazing, but none of it's real. None of it's really true, right? On the inside, they're like corrupted, okay? So moving on to the next page, it talks about him having knowledge. So if you look at like the fourth paragraph, it's the second to last paragraph on page 4. He says, and so with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. So it's the idea that this is a rebirth for Nick Carraway. He's making himself a new person, kind of like you made yourself a new person when you went from middle school to high school, right? You were like, I'm going to be a new, different me. And it'll be the same when you go from high school to college. I'm going to be a new, different me. And then when you leave college, you'll be like, I'm going to be a new, different me, right? So remember we talked about the idea of identity formation and how we're constantly reinventing ourselves, but there's also like a kernel of self that exists there, or questionably exists there, right? It's the same idea with society. Society is constantly reinventing itself and the pendulum is swinging and we're getting out of the cave, but there's also that kernel of what society is. So that kernel could be a reflection of mankind, it could be a reflection of man, or maybe it's just its own thing. And this book helps us examine the difference between the self and the society within self, right? And the unique society that is specifically American. So the next part, it says, there was so much to read for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes of banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold. Gold is important, by the way, so follow that. Like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only, and I circled these because again, it's an allusion, Midas, Morgan, and Mycenaeus knew. Okay, so Midas is a reference to, you've probably heard of King Midas. Remember, he's the one who everything he touched turned to gold, and it was really sad because he ended up touching the face of his daughter and killing her. And then Morgan and Mycenaeus are actually real. Morgan refers to J.P. Morgan, as in the banking family. And then Mycenaeus was actually the Roman patron of literature. So a patron is someone who gives money to, and he gave money to the idea of literature. So he would give money to writers to write and artists to produce written work, right? And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. So he goes on to talk about the idea of knowledge. But I think this particular sentence, and I actually underlined it in my book, I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money. So the idea of new money, and it was actually a term that they used in the 1920s, which is nouveau riche. You guys call it today being bougie. It's the same thing. Okay, so the same thing. It's the idea that you've got money, but it's not like old money. It's not like sugar baron money. It's money that people are just now acquiring. And because they are just now acquiring this money, they, one, don't know how to invest it properly so that it makes more money. But two, they sometimes spend it on frivolous things that are just to show how rich they are. So for example, if you win the lottery and you say, okay, now I'm going to buy a, $500,000 Lamborghini or whatever it is, as opposed to taking my old, 2008 Hyundai Sonata. Some people could see that as being like, I'm going to show off my money. And that's one of the things that Nick talks about. But for him, remember, it's the idea of the contrast between money and morality. For him, it's not money, it's knowledge, because he talks about the books looking like new money, which means he has great intention to read them, but he doesn't. Right? So he doesn't really use them. They're just kind of for show. And then he moves on and talks about the idea of West egg. So again, the idea of the egg being outside is pure and the inside is decay. Now there's all of this stuff where he goes into these allusions talking about like the Hotel de Ville in Normandy, the towers. He's describing Gatsby's mansion. I strongly suggest you delve into some of the symbolism there. I don't, just because there's so much that you can dissect in this book. I don't think that we're going to have time. So I'm mainly going to focus on the symbols of the egg and color symbolism, and then also characterization. But it's really interesting stuff as far as the house itself and how it sort of looks like a castle. Okay, so for me on page 7, we hear the first description of Tom Buchanan. Remember, I told you all of the names in this book are really symbolic. So Buchanan, and it's spelled as like beau. It's spelled as like B-A-U. And a beau is a boyfriend. Like back in the day, they used to say, oh, that's my beau, and that meant your boyfriend. Like you call it your boo or your bae or whatever it is. It's the same idea, right? It's your love. And then cannon is just like what it sounds like. It's a cannon. It goes boom. Okay, so if you can imagine someone who is so aggressive that literally his name means like cannon of passion. Okay, so let's look at the description of Tom Buchanan. For me, it's the top of page 7, and I have this version. Whatever that version is. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and supercilious manner. Listen to the way that Nick Carraway describes him, because it's very dismissive and kind of cruel, right? And he says that he like is snobbishly repeating his judgments, right? 2 shining, arrogant eyes established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes, which again, I can hear my feminist critics right now going, why do the riding clothes have to be effeminate? I know. He's a male writer. Just leave it alone. We don't have time to dissect all of that because there's a lot there, trust me. His riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained at the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting from his shoulder when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was the body capable of enormous leverage. And look at this, is the very last line, and it's right after a dash, right? You know I love my dashes. Dash, a cruel body. His speaking voice was gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. Now, it's interesting that Carraway says fractiousness, because fractiousness implies that it is